The pen was already moving before Frederick Dino looked up. That was the detail that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not the gasps from the boardroom assistants. Not the way Jimmy went completely still beside him. Not even the sound of the leather chair scraping the polished floor as the woman at the head of the table rose slowly to her feet. It was the pen, already moving, the ink already drying, the damage already done. Frederick's eyes traveled the length of that long mahogany table, past the framed architectural renderings, past the crystal water jugs, past the pale faces of men in suits who all seemed to already know something he did not, until they landed on her.
Kamila, his wife.
Sitting at the head of the table of the $800 million real estate empire he had just signed shares into. Shares he had liquidated their joint savings to purchase. Shares he had intended to quietly transfer to Rita, the woman he had been sleeping with for 7 months. Kamila did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She simply looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already buried, and said, quietly to the room, "Gentlemen, I believe you have now met my husband." The pen dropped from Frederick's hand and rolled to the edge of the table. Nobody picked it up. Before we continue, let me ask you something quietly. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it in your part of the world? Some of us are hearing this story under the hot afternoon sun. Some in the calm of the night, when thoughts are heavy and hearts are open. Different places, one story, one lesson. If stories like this speak to your heart, please subscribe to the channel. Your like helps this story reach another soul. Your comment tells me you understand the lesson. And when you share, you may be saving someone from the same mistake. Now, let us continue. 3 months before that boardroom, Frederick Dino was the kind of man Abuja celebrated. He drove a charcoal gray Mercedes GLE, wore anchor-print pocket squares to corporate dinners, and laughed loudly at the right moments. He had a 5-bedroom home in Maitama, a wife whom everyone described as elegant, and a LinkedIn profile that used words like visionary and growth architect, terms he had written himself on a slow Tuesday afternoon when the office was quiet and his ego needed feeding. What Frederick also carried, beneath all of it, was a growing and quietly devastating resentment toward Kamila. Not because she had done anything wrong. That was the part he could never fully explain, even to himself. Kamila Dino was composed in a way that made Frederick feel permanently observed. She asked careful questions. She never raised her voice. She remembered details of conversations from months prior and referenced them with a precision that unsettled him. She moved through their home and their social life with a stillness that Frederick had once found magnetic and had gradually, privately, come to find suffocating. Something about her stillness made him feel small. And a man like Frederick Dino could not tolerate feeling small inside his own house. He had convinced himself, over many evenings, that Kamila was hiding something. Not because he had evidence. Because it was easier than admitting that his wife was simply more composed than he was, more disciplined, more quietly certain of herself than he had ever managed to be despite every car, every blazer, every loud laugh at the right moment. The signs had been there for anyone paying honest attention. Kamila took phone calls in the study with the door closed. She had a separate laptop she never left open on the kitchen counter the way he left his. Once, clearing papers from her desk, Frederick had seen a letterhead, the logo of a company called Sovereign Crest Realty Properties, and asked about it with the casual tone of a man pretending not to care. She had told him, without hesitation, that it was a client document belonging to a colleague. He had believed her because believing her cost him nothing in that moment. Frederick always believed what required the least from him. Their marriage had been built in the way many Abuja marriages were constructed, with family approval, social alignment, and the shared understanding that both parties were assembling something together that looked correct from the outside. Frederick had proposed because Kamila was the right choice in every visible category. Kamila had accepted because she loved him, though she was never entirely certain he understood the distance between loving someone and finding them convenient.
3 years in, no children had arrived.
Fola, Kamila's mother, telephoned every Sunday with questions wrapped in warmth that barely concealed their urgency. Uncle Martin, Kamila's uncle and the family's moral pillar, had pulled Frederick aside at a Christmas gathering in Lugby and said, without softening it, "A man who does not water his own garden should not be surprised when another man's crops grow there." Frederick had laughed it off and reached for another drink. He met Rita Dyke at a business networking event in the Central Business District in April. She wore a coral blazer and spoke with the unguarded confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone she respected. She laughed before Frederick finished his jokes, not because she was entertained, though he did not know that yet, but because she understood precisely what men like Frederick needed to hear in the first 10 minutes. She called him Freddie. Nobody else used that name. The novelty of it felt, absurdly, like being seen. By the end of May, the affair was no longer something Frederick was testing or qualifying in his mind. It had become something he had fully committed to, and commitment, once Frederick gave it to the wrong thing, had a way of moving very fast. Kingsley noticed the change first. He always did. But Kingsley said nothing. And in the silence of that Maytama house, where Kamila moved quietly and Frederick watched her and told himself she was hiding something, the decision that would destroy him was already beginning to form. It was Rita who introduced the idea. That was what Frederick would later remember, that he had not arrived at it himself. That it had been handed to him carefully, over a Tuesday evening dinner in Was 2, while soft Afrobeats played from a Bluetooth speaker on Rita's kitchen counter, and she refilled his glass without being asked, the way she always did, as though anticipating him was something she had been practicing.
She had been researching, she said.
Leaning forward slightly, her manicured fingers wrapped around her own glass, her voice dropping to the register she used when she wanted Frederick to feel like he was being trusted with something rare. There was a real estate investment company, private, not publicly listed, but opening a limited share window to carefully selected outside investors. The returns were significant. The company held active development projects across Abuja, Lagos, and Port Harcourt. It was, Rita told him with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this, the kind of quiet, compounding wealth that old Nigerian money families used to stay wealthy across generations. The company was called Sovereign Crest Realty Properties. Frederick did not flinch at the name. He had encountered it once, months ago on Kamila's desk, and had filed it away in the category of things that did not immediately concern him. That category, in Frederick's mind, was very large and very full. Rita slid a prospectus across the table. 48 pages, professionally bound with a deep navy cover and gold lettering. Frederick received it with both hands and flipped through it with the expression of a man performing due diligence rather than actually conducting it. The portfolio was vast. The project renderings were impressive, gleaming mixed-use towers, gated residential estates, commercial developments with international standard finishes. The numbers across the financial pages were the kind that made a certain type of man's chest tighten with want. On the ownership page, buried beneath legal language and corporate structure diagrams, the founding principal was listed as K. Dino Holdings, silent majority shareholder. Frederick's eyes moved across that line, without stopping. His brain processed the letters without assembling them into meaning. He turned the page. "I want to be part of this," Rita said, her eyes steady on his face. "I want us to build something real together, Freddie. Not just dinners and phone calls. Something permanent. Something that shows this means something." Frederick looked at her across the low candlelight and felt the specific, intoxicating pride of a man who believes he is being chosen, not for what he has, but for who he is. It was a feeling Kamila had stopped producing in him, or so he told himself. The truth, which he would only fully meet later in a compound in Otukpo with nothing but time, was that Kamila had never stopped. He had simply stopped being present enough to receive it. He did not ask Rita where she had sourced the prospectus. He did not ask who had shown it to her or why a private company would approach someone through such an informal channel. He did not ask why a woman asking him to prove his love was pointing him toward a financial instrument rather than a conversation. He asked how much it would take. The answer arrived without hesitation, which, in retrospect, was itself an answer. Acquiring a shareholding significant enough to carry boardroom access and transfer rights required liquidating the joint savings account he and Kamila maintained together, plus breaking a fixed deposit held in both their names. The combined figure sat at just over 62 million naira, a number large enough to matter, a number Kamila would eventually notice. Frederick told himself she would not notice quickly. He told himself her consulting income, or whatever it was she actually did behind that study door, covered her own needs comfortably. He told himself this was not theft from his wife. It was reallocation of shared resources toward a smarter future. He constructed the justification with the same energy he usually reserved for LinkedIn captions, and it held just long enough to be dangerous. The share purchase was processed in early September through a third-party brokerage account Frederick had quietly opened in his name alone 3 weeks prior. The transfer paperwork naming Rita as sole beneficiary of his stake was prepared by a private legal firm in Garki that asked no difficult questions because Frederick paid them not to have any. Kingsley found out the way second-born sons often find out things in Nigerian families, sideways, by accident, through a conversation not intended for him. He had arrived at the Maitama house one Wednesday afternoon to drop off documents for Frederick and found Kamila alone in the sitting room. She had offered him tea and mentioned, with the careful neutrality she applied to everything, that the joint account had experienced significant and unusual activity. She did not accuse. She did not name Frederick directly. She simply released the information into the room the way she released most things, as a fact, unheld, left to land where it chose. Kingsley sat with what he had heard for 3 full days. On the 3rd day, he drove to Frederick's office in the central business district, parked in the car park, and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for 40 minutes watching the building entrance. He rehearsed what he would say. He thought about Kamila's face and the careful neutrality she had used to describe something that was clearly causing her pain beneath the surface. He thought about Frederick and the particular blindness of elder brothers who have always been told they are right. Then he started the engine and drove away. Jimmy, when Frederick shared the plan in confidence over drinks at a bar in Maitama, responded with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of a man who had nothing personally at stake. He said it was exactly the kind of bold financial thinking that separated men of substance from men of salary. He said Kamila had always seemed to be operating in her own private world anyway, which in Jimmy's estimation made Frederick's move not betrayal but self-preservation. He ordered another round and toasted to Frederick's future. Jimmy had always been the kind of friend who made catastrophic decisions sound like momentum. The signing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning at Sovereign Crest Realty Properties headquarters, a glass tower on Agi Iransi Street that Frederick had driven past hundreds of times without registering. He arrived in his charcoal Mercedes with Jimmy beside him and a feeling in his chest he mistook for destiny. He did not know that 45 minutes before he left the house that morning, a legal notification had arrived on a separate laptop in the study of his Maitama home. He did not know that 2 phone calls had been made. He did not know that his wife had dressed carefully, driven through a private entrance, and taken a private elevator to a boardroom where her name, Frederick Dino, founding principal, was engraved on a brass plate beside the chairman's door. He only found out when he looked up from the pen. The boardroom of Sovereign Crest Realty Properties occupied the entire 14th floor of the glass tower on Agi Iransi Street, and on the morning Frederick Dino walked into it to sign away his future, the harmattan light was cutting through the tinted windows and long, amber columns that made everything look preserved, like something already becoming a memory. Frederick had been confident walking in. Jimmy had clapped him on the shoulder in the elevator. The receptionist had offered them water, and Frederick had waved it away with the casual authority of a man who felt at home in rooms like this. He did not feel at home for long. The legal team was already seated. 5 people, 3 women and 2 men, all in dark suits, all with folders open in front of them. One of them had smiled at Frederick when he entered, and he had smiled back without registering that the smile was not welcoming. It was the carefully neutral expression of a professional watching something unfold exactly as expected. The documents were placed in front of Frederick. He reviewed them with Jimmy looking over his shoulder, nodding at things neither of them fully understood. The numbers were correct. The share percentage was correct. Rita's name appeared in the beneficiary column, clean and unambiguous. Frederick picked up the pen
and signed.
The The room was silent for precisely 4 seconds, the kind of silence that has weight and shape. Then the door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Kamila walked in wearing a deep burgundy dress and heels that clicked against the floor in a rhythm so measured it sounded like a countdown. She carried a leather portfolio. Her hair was pinned. Her face was composed in a way that Frederick had spent 3 years misreading as coldness and was only now, standing in the ruin of his own choices, beginning to understand was something else entirely. She took her seat at the head of the table. She opened her portfolio. She did not look at Frederick for a long moment. When she did, it was with the tired clarity of a woman who had hoped to be wrong and had not been. "Gentlemen," she said, "I believe you have now met my husband." One of the lawyers leaned forward and began to explain, in the calm tone of someone rehearsed, that the share transfer Frederick had just signed was legally void. Under Sovereign Crest Realty's founding charter, spousal acquisition of company shares required the written consent of the founding principal before any transfer to a third party could be executed. The founding principal was Kamila. No such consent had been given. The shares remained in Frederick's name. The transfer to Rita was null. Frederick's 62 million naira was gone. The shares were trapped in his name within a company he did not understand and could not exit without Kamila's approval. And Kamila's approval, it was now devastatingly clear, was not something Frederick had any currency left to purchase. Jimmy stood up. He said something. Frederick couldn't hear it properly. The blood was too loud in his ears, and one of the lawyers quietly directed him to sit down. Frederick looked at his wife. "How long?" he asked. His voice came out smaller than he intended. Kamila closed her portfolio. "Sovereign Crest Realty has been operating for 9 years, Frederick. I founded it the year before I met you." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was the specific quiet of a man realizing that the story he had been telling himself about his own life was not the story he had actually been living. He had married a woman worth $800 million. He had stolen from her to fund a gift for another woman. And he had walked, voluntarily, into her boardroom to sign the proof. Kamila stood, nodded once to the legal team, and walked toward the side exit. At the door, she paused without turning around. "I want you out of the house by Friday," she said. Then she was gone. Frederick sat in that boardroom for a long time after everyone else had left. Jimmy had disappeared somewhere around the 5th minute. The amber harmattan light moved across the table slowly, the way light moves when nobody is watching it. The pen was still on the floor where he had dropped it. Nobody had picked it up. The family gathering was not called a meeting. In their world, it was never called a meeting. It was called a conversation, which was the word Fola used when she telephoned Uncle Martin the evening after the boardroom, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a mother who had issued warnings that were not received and was now being asked to witness the consequences she had predicted. They gathered at the family compound in Lugby on a Saturday morning. Fola, Uncle Martin, Kingsley, and 2 of Frederick's paternal aunts who had driven in from Kefi before sunrise. The sitting room was arranged the way it always was for serious family matters, chairs pulled into a deliberate formation, the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, the louved windows throwing horizontal strips of morning light across the terrazzo floor. Kamila was not present. She had sent word through Uncle Martin that she had said everything she needed to say in that boardroom, and that the family was free to proceed without her attendance. That absence said more than a full speech could have managed. Every person in that room understood it. Nobody commented on it directly, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Frederick arrived 40 minutes late. He walked in wearing a plain gray kaftan rather than one of his tailored blazers, and the difference was not lost on anyone present. He looked reduced, not physically, but in the way a man looks when the story he has been telling about himself has been publicly disproved, and he has not yet located a replacement narrative. His eyes were the eyes of someone who had not slept, and his jaw carried the tight, restless tension of a man with nowhere left to direct his energy. Uncle Martin opened with a prayer. It lasted 4 minutes, and was constructed with the careful precision of a man who understood that every word he chose was also a verdict. Nobody said amen with any conviction when it ended. Then Fola spoke. Fola was not a woman who raised her voice. She had built her entire life on the understanding that volume was what people used when they had exhausted their precision. What she delivered to Frederick that Saturday morning was not a rebuke in any conventional sense. It was a complete and methodical account of what had happened, spoken with the calm of someone who had rehearsed none of it because she had not needed to. The facts were sufficient on their own. She told him that Kamila had known about Rita since June, that she had chosen not to confront Frederick because she needed to understand the full shape of his intentions before she decided how to respond, that the moment the share purchase notification arrived on her laptop, she understood with complete clarity what kind of man she had married and what she was required to do next. "She did not chase you," Fola said, her eyes never leaving Frederick's face. "She did not cry in front of you. She did not beg. She waited with patience and dignity for you to show her the complete truth of who you are. And you delivered it personally. You walked it into her own boardroom and placed it on her table." Frederick opened his mouth once and closed it again. Then Kingsley spoke. That was the moment the room changed temperature. Because Kingsley's confession, delivered quietly, without drama, without deflection, landed on the gathering with a weight that nobody had anticipated. He told them he had known, that he had seen enough to understand what was happening, that he had driven to Frederick's office with the full intention of intervening and had turned back without leaving his car, that he had told himself it was not his place when the truth was that it was inconvenient, and he had dressed his cowardice in the language of respect. One of the aunts exhaled sharply. Uncle Martin kept his eyes closed for a long moment. Frederick looked directly at his younger brother. "You knew?" His voice arrived smaller than intended. "I knew enough," Kingsley said. "And I chose comfort over truth. I was wrong." The grief that settled over the room after that had multiple origins and no single owner. It belonged to everyone present in different proportions: grief for Kamila's dignity, grief for the marriage, grief for the specific and very Nigerian failure of people who see disaster forming and decide that silence is the same thing as loyalty. Rita had texted Frederick the night of the boardroom, 3 hours after he had called her twice without answer. The message was 7 words: "I think it's best we don't speak." He had called again. She had not replied. The woman who had called him Freddie over candlelight, who had placed a prospectus in his hands and spoken about building something permanent, she had calculated the ruins, confirmed there was nothing recoverable, and removed herself with the clean efficiency of someone who had maintained an exit from the very beginning. Jimmy had not been seen or heard from since the boardroom elevator doors closed behind him. By the time the gathering concluded, no dramatic pronouncements were made. The conclusions arrived the way serious family conclusions always do in homes like this: quietly stated, collectively understood, and entirely without appeal. Frederick would make no claim against any of Kamila's holdings. He had no legal standing within Sovereign Crest Realty, no recoverable investment, and no ally remaining in any room that mattered. He stood to leave before the morning was finished. His mother, seated in the corner chair nearest the window throughout the entire gathering, did not rise. She had walked Frederick to the door or to his car every single time he had left this compound since he was a boy. Every visit, every departure. Without exception and without being asked, it was simply what she did, the particular grammar of a mother's love made physical. She remained in her chair. She did not look up. Frederick stood at the doorway for 3 seconds longer than necessary, his leather bag over one shoulder, waiting for something that did not come. Then he walked out into the compound alone, past the mango tree, through the gate, and into a morning that received him with complete indifference. It was not the money that finally broke him on that walk to his car. It was the sound of a chair that did not scrape the floor. Frederick Dino left Abuja in October, 3 weeks after the boardroom. He did not announce his departure. There was nobody left to announce it to. The Maitama house had been placed under Kamila's sole name through documentation that had apparently always existed, a prenuptial legal framework that Kamila's lawyers had quietly maintained for 9 years, invisible to Frederick because he had never thought to look. The cars were leased under company accounts. The club memberships were in Kamila's name. The social life they had shared was, upon examination, largely built on Kamila's relationships and Kamila's quiet financing. Frederick had been living inside his wife's world the entire time and had mistaken it for his own. He moved to his family's ancestral compound in Otukpo, a place he had not spent more than 5 consecutive days in since he was 19 years old. The compound was clean but modest, a concrete bungalow, a mango tree in the yard, a neighborhood where people knew his mother's name and would now learn, slowly and without restraint, the outline of what her firstborn son had done. His mother, Grace Dino, had not spoken to him directly since the family gathering. She spoke about him, to aunties, to neighbors, to God in what Frederick suspected were extensive nightly negotiations, but the specific silence between them in the same room was a punishment more complete than anything formal. It was Uncle Martin who visited him in Otukpo 6 weeks after the boardroom, arriving on a Thursday afternoon unannounced and sitting across from Frederick in the yard under the mango tree, as though they had planned it. Uncle Martin did not bring comfort. He was not built for comfort in moments that had not earned it. "You looked at that woman every day," Uncle Martin said, "and you saw someone beneath you. That was your first sin and your last mistake." Pride dressed as suspicion. Frederick had no argument. He had run through every version of a counter-narrative in the weeks since Abuja and arrived, each time, at the same place. He had been wrong. Not just about Kamila's wealth. About her. About who she was and what she deserved and what he had owed her. He had diagnosed her silence as secrecy and her composure as coldness, and had used both conclusions to justify betrayal. The money was gone. That was simply mathematics, and it did not keep him awake. What kept him awake was the memory of Kamila's face in that boardroom. Not angry, not triumphant, but tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who had loved a person carefully and been repaid with carelessness. She had not engineered a trap. She had simply built her life with integrity, kept it protected with legal precision, and when Frederick walked into her boardroom to dismantle it, she had been there. That was all. She had simply been there. Kingsley came to Otukpo in November. He came without being asked, which mattered. He sat with Frederick and did not offer solutions because there were none. What he offered was presence, the complicated, guilt-weighted presence of a brother who had failed a sister-in-law he respected by protecting a brother who had not deserved it. They did not speak easily, but they spoke. Kamila, in the months that followed, did not speak publicly about any of it. She returned to work. She signed a new development deal, a mixed-use complex in Abuja's Jabi district, the largest single project Zenith Anchor had undertaken. Her photograph appeared in a business publication that Frederick saw on his phone one evening, seated at a new boardroom table, calm and unhurried, her leather portfolio open in front of her. She had not divorced him. She had simply left, legally, financially, emotionally, in a departure so complete that the absence of a divorce decree felt not like an oversight but like a final statement. There was nothing left to dissolve. She had already separated herself from everything that no longer served her life. Frederick's 62 million naira remained locked in shares he could not touch. He had no access to the company, no legal standing within it, and no means of recovering the investment without Kamila's signature, a signature she was under no obligation to provide and had given no indication she ever would. He had purchased a cage and climbed inside it to give it to another woman. And that woman was gone. In the compound in Otukpo, on a dry November evening with a mango tree standing dark against the last light, Frederick Dino sat with the fullness of what his life had become. Not dramatically, not with tears, just with the quiet, irreversible weight of a man who had held something extraordinary in his hands and had confused it for ordinary. Some losses announced themselves with noise. This one had arrived in silence, and it would remain there, settled and permanent, for as long as he lived. Somewhere in Abuja, Kamila signed her name to a new beginning. She used a different pen. The man who underestimated his wife's silence mistook her stillness for ignorance. But some women do not fight back. They simply build, quietly, legally, and completely, until the day a man walks into the room he never knew belonged to her. By then, it is already too late to leave. Thank you for staying with me to the end. Comment your thoughts on the betrayal, and tell me where you are watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more gripping stories like this. What do you think happens next? Comment below.